Okay, so Sergio holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Cologne, Germany, where he conducted research on the methodological renewal of first philosophy in Husserl's Fenomenology. And he's currently a full-time postdoc researcher in the Center for Phenomenology and Continental Philosophy at the Leuven, where he works on the application of phenomenological methods for the analysis of social conflict in the field of violence research. His most recent publication is entitled The Discussion Between José Gauss and Luis Primeiro about the concept of life growth, critical evaluation of the decisive episode in the history of the reception of Husserl's phenomenology in Spain and Mexico. He's a member of the International Research Network, Literary and Philosophical Legacy of the Spanish Exile in Mexico, based in Wuppertal, Germany, of the Latin American Circle of Phenomenology, and of the Centro Mexicano de Investigaciones Fenomenológicas. So Sergio, whenever you want to start, and I want to remind everyone who's here again, if you want to ask a question in Portuguese after you talk, you can translate. So Sergio, whenever you please.
Thank you very much, Filipe, for this kind of presentation. Can you hear me well? Okay, great. And well, I want to start by thanking also Dr. Flávio, Curvello, good friends and colleague from the University of Cologne, from the Husserl Heights, where we worked together some years. And it's an honor for me and a privilege to be here, and also a great opportunity to present some research intentions. My presentation will be quite short. As I say, I will not present research results, but research intentions, so please do not expect something very conclusive. But I will present a work hypothesis and advance some expected results. You won't see me quoting Husserl or speaking about him, because I am trying to apply his methodology to a subject that is not a subject of first philosophy. Matthias and Paulo have masterfully spoken of a very complex problem in Husserl's first philosophy, which is the presupposition of intersubjectivity for the grounding and ultimate grounding of knowledge. My field of research is right now quite far away from that, but I do use what Husserl calls the general scheme ego cogito cogitatum, for the intentional analysis of violence as a form of social interaction. So let me show you what I understand by this. First of all, I will just very quickly show you what is the general scheme and how we can adapt this scheme for the analysis of social phenomena. It is an intersubjective, we could say, transformation of the general scheme, but it's nothing original for me. Everything is already there in Husserl's works. It's not what I'm doing is not revolutionary or new or fashionable. It's just a textbook, I would say. So I would, but it will sound strange for hardcore classical Husserl scholars. I will now share my screen with you. I don't know if I need some authorization to share it, because it doesn't allow me to share it here.
No, you shouldn't need any authorization.
Okay.
But if you're having trouble, you can always send us the slides, and then we can share them. It doesn't work in any other way.
Okay. Yes. How can I send it to you?
You can send it by email.
Okay, then let me do it very quickly. Because it's so I sent it out. In the meanwhile, I will keep trying to share it myself. Maybe it will work. Oh, I think I will merge it now. I think you should be watching my screen now. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Then I will go ahead with the general scheme. So the general scheme, ego cogito cogitatum, Husserl says, means literally, here, I have the lived experience of an objective state of affairs appearing to me. So I have the lived experience of phenomena that are before my eyes or my ears, and so on. So this is a very simple scheme with massive philosophical presuppositions, of course. Nonetheless, it is very easy to use, as I will attempt to show you now. So if we try to transform or to give an intersubjective touch to this scheme, and specifically apply to the phenomenon of violence, it would go more or less like this. On one side, on the side of the agent, we have one ego cogito, one I living in her or his own life world, we could say, to keep up with the current phenomenological terminology. And this ego cogito has lived experience, I, of exerting violence. I exert violence. On the other hand of the intersubjective relation, we would have an alter ego in relation to the first ego, who would have the experience of suffering, of undergoing violence performed by other subjects. This ego cogito would then have the experience, I suffer violence. On the side of the objective, or on the side of the phenomena, of the objective phenomena appearing to these subjects, we would have, the data is the plural of comitatum, we would have the intersubjective situation of violence, where the agent of the violent action experiences the situation from his or her own perspective, and the victim of a violent action experiences his or her own cogitata from her own perspective. So we have here non-shared perspectives of a shared situation, an intersubjective situation. On this side, on the side of the agent, we could say I have the lived experience of using or abusing bodily and or psychological force against other subjects in the pursuit of my own interests, which are rooted not only in my will as an abstract one, but also in the social habits that I have developed throughout the history of my own experience. On the side of the victim, we would say I have the lived experience of undergoing physical or psychological aggression. In the face of an aggressive force directed against me, I can ask for help or take flight or resist, for example, through the deterrence as a form of stand your ground attitude, or I can counterattack or also simply remain helpless. On the side of the noemata, we could say, of the objective phenomena, we would have something like a diversity of interests colliding in encounters where subjects of consciousness interact by exerting or undergoing physical and or psychological force. We would have an interplay of aggressiveness and vulnerability. Now, this scheme is the methodological framework of my current research. And now I will take another viewpoint as a starting point, and a very different one, much more general. And I would ask you, if you suppose, and this is not a didactical game, right? This is just pure research, a problem of pure research. If you spot a contradiction between my general scheme and what I am about to tell, you should tell me, because it is very important for me to realize right now in the initial phase of my research work if there are contradictions. So I am starting. One of the very last lines of a German film called The Year of the First Kisses says as follows. The line says as follows: the important thing about happiness is not that it is finite, that is limited in space and time, but that it is possible. Well, something very similar applies also to violence. The important thing about it is not that it is finite. That is to say that we live in more or less violent places and times, but that it is always possible, and it is always possible in all the possible degrees of its brutality. Violence is always possible because it is radically intertwined with the ways in which we experience the social world as subjects of collective consciousness, as subjects that bear in themselves a history of experience, and as subjects of action in a constant struggle for survival. The most general leading questions of violence research in general are: how is violence possible, and how could we render it, if not impossible, at least less probable to happen? What impels us towards violence or inhibits us from it? And first of all, of course, what exactly is violence? Recent research on violence shows that there is an ideological tension in specialized literature between contextualist relativism and conceptual universalism concerning the very concept of violence. Some researchers say, for instance, both from the field of philosophy and sociology and psychology, they say that what we regard as violence depends on cultural contexts, that the concept of violence is indexical, which means that it means something different depending on who says it when, depending on who uses it, and that thus it is impossible to come up with a universal definition for it, for the concept of violence. Other researchers, mainly from the field of philosophy, say, no, violence is simply and plainly the action of attacking brought about by the interaction between agents, victims, and eventually witnesses of an aggression. A classic counterexample to the latter says, in the Middle Ages, surgery was widely regarded as violence against both the patient and God, because it was painfully cutting the body of the patient and arrogantly and blasphemously trying to fix or improve what God created. Nowadays, however, surgery is not regarded as violent anymore, at least not in Western cultures. This counterexample is supposed to show that the meaning of the concept of violence depends on the cultural context of its use. One could say, well, it all depends on the intention of the surgeon. Of the surgeon as a medical practitioner, of course. And intention is, of course, the key term here. In what follows, I will attempt to show that the intentional analysis is in phenomenological sense, and especially in the sense of Husserl's general scheme, constitutes a bottom-up philosophical approach that makes possible a return to the basics that restores the conceptual groundwork of radical philosophical thinking, a return to the lowlands of experience where the very possibility of aggressive action is born amidst the landscape of consciousness. My work hypothesis is the following. The experience of disagreement accompanied by negative emotions like annoyance, frustration, and anger, are transcendental conditions. No, sorry, I will read it again. The experience of disagreement accompanied by negative emotions and escalation are transcendental conditions of possibility for interpersonal violence. Without these conditions, we could still have pain-inflicting mistreatment. For example, hunting and other kinds of animal slaughter as a means for survival. But we would not have violence as a form of willfully destructive personal interaction that arises from social conflict. But what is a social conflict? What is action and interaction? I take my departure point from the following preliminary definition. Violence is a form of action, that is to say, action, a set of acts unified by motivation and purpose, in which we use our vital force or some aspect of it to impose our will on others in a way that is not necessarily abusive but certainly harmful for them. The basic presuppositions of violent action understood this way are the following. Violent actions presuppose necessarily an agent and a victim, and more often than not, they also involve witnesses, be it immediate or non-immediate ones. The phenomena of consciousness that are involved in violent actions are both emotional and rational. This is crucial. In violence, emotion, thinking, and action are inseparable from each other. Every action, as conscious action of a subjective agent, an embodied consciousness in its own life work, presupposes decision, willing, valuing, emotion, as environment-related feelings like fear and anger, believing and perceiving. And here we need to slow down a bit because these are the truly transcendental presupposition of this phenomena. I will share again the presentation. This presupposition, I just said that action is a set of acts unified by motivation and purpose. Subject of consciousness in practical action is practically motivated to pursue a goal. The elements of this set unfold as a process in which acts confirm and continue, halt and modify, or interrupt and discontinue the course of action initiated in previous acts. Now, action presupposes decision, which is the act of fixing the course of imminent action by which consciousness transits from willing to doing. Decision presupposes will, which is the act of wanting directed towards situations that we can realize, things that we can achieve, etc. Will presupposes valorative assessment, no matter how implicit or explicit. Valorative assessment is the act of considering as good or bad, desirable or undesirable, convenient or inconvenient, right or wrong, and so on. Valorative assessment.
Are you sharing your screen? Because we can't
Sorry,
see.
what?
Are you sharing your screen right now?
Yeah, I did. It is. You're not seeing it?
No, you can see.
No.
Oh, sorry. Wow, I don't know what happened. What about now?
Yeah.
And now? Okay, great. Yeah, I was just going through these very simple slides, so you missed anything essential. I was saying just the intentional presuppositions of action are decision, will, valorative assessment, belief, which is the act of taking for granted what we do not clearly see or perceive. Belief presupposes emotion. Emotion is a tricky one because it's not really an act. Emotion is feeling accompanying one's own acts and deriving from one's own experiences with others and the shared environment. For example, fear and anger, be it shared fear of a co-perceived threat or fear of one another, be it anger with or against one another. And finally, emotion presupposes also perception, which is the act of intuitively grasping, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, or clearly understanding as opposed to significantly meaning or blindly believing. So sorry. Once we have established the basic spheres of consciousness involving violence, which they are all a field of analysis, the key term, now we can establish that the key term, or we can advance that the key term for a phenomenological description of violent actions is escalation. This is the key phenomenon that will allow us to draw the line that goes from slight disagreement to annoyance, to concealed aggression, to open aggression, to assault as physical aggression, to vicious assault as life-threatening physical aggression, and to murder. Escalation is a transition phenomenon. It is the heating up of a conflict, an increase in its intensity. That is to say, it is the aggravation of the confrontation between opposing wills. This aggravation, just as disagreement, can occur on different levels of consciousness. In what we believe, for example, in what we value, or also in what we do as a practical action, presupposing the other skills of consciousness. And escalation can occur more or less gradually, running forth and back, which means that it increases or decreases in shorter or longer periods of time. Escalation runs through different spheres of consciousness presupposed by action. As I said, like for example, belief and valuing. And this happens in a way that it builds up as it runs through. Under certain circumstances, with every increased degree in escalation, the emotion takes over the practical action of the subject more and more, while cold-blooded thinking, so to speak, steps back in the course of action. That is to say, circumspection, consciousness, and forehanded thought fade away, while emotions rule more and more. Fear leads to the will to flee, leaving everything behind, and anger leads to the will to use force, to attack, and ultimately, if emotions are fully running the show, to destroy. I will come now to the close of my presentation. I don't even want to call it conclusion. The elements I just stopped sharing my screen, the elements of analysis presented above are transcendental presuppositions of violent conflict seen on the background of the intersubjective general scheme ego cogito cogitata, which we could also call nos cogitamos cogitata, that's not really important. The thing is that this scheme is my methodological framework, as I say, and it pretty much possibilitates what I consider as a phenomenological approach to violence as a bottom-up conceptual analysis. In other words, I propose a bottom-up phenomenological analysis on the concept of violence that begins with the lowlands of experience. This is an expression of Luca Loma. An approach that starts off with our own lived experience and then goes further step by step along the lines of the intersubjective scheme. Now, as a final word, please bear in mind that true conceptual analysis, as Matthias was pointing out, is not only a matter of words, much more of the kind of reality that we mean when we use words. Conceptual analysis deals thus with the correlations between subjective experience, meaning expression, and meant states of affairs. The analysis of these correlations is the so-called intentional analysis, as phenomenological analysis of correlations between consciousness, signification, and being. In this case, the consciousness is our consciousness as social beings, the signification is the very concept of violence, and the state of affairs that we mean is the sad reality of our often very violent relations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thanks, Sergio, for your presentation. Does anybody want to ask a question? Again, if you want to ask in Portuguese, I can translate.
I would like to ask something. At the end of your abstract, you told us you could maybe try to defend a transcendental standpoint about the phenomenon of violence. And I would like to know if you could talk to us a little bit more about this idea. How could it be maybe more interesting, more pressing, more promising to analyze the phenomenon of violence from a transcendental standpoint? And what could I do So with this kind of approach that I could not do with other ones, or maybe with other kinds of phenomenology, more empirically driven phenomenologies, or maybe, I don't know, alternative approaches to conscious phenomena.
Yeah, thank you, Flavio. In my own view, but we can discuss it, the transcendental approach answers to the question, how do we come into a situation mediated by phenomena of consciousness? That is to say, what do we mean when we say violence, and what happens in us and through us when violent conflict arises in our social relations. And my whole presentation is a transcendental approach, so I claim, because it addresses presuppositions of consciousness without which the speech and self-thinking of violence would be utterly impossible. For example, action as a set of acts motivated in the history of experience. Talking about violence without this presupposition, without the presupposition of this phenomenon of consciousness, the phenomenon of practical action with its presuppositions of consciousness, would be impossible on the one hand, and I believe it leads, speaking without considering these conditions of possibility, leads in the empirical science to a lot of confusion about the possibility of generalizing a concept of violence, because current empirical studies are all about we cannot say what is violence because it's dependent on cultural context, and it would be violent from our side to try to impose our academic Occidental concept to other cultures, to other communities. And I believe this form of relativism, so to speak, is grounded in in a lack of radicality of the conceptual analysis. So if we focus on the analysis of all those phenomena of consciousness that necessarily underlie the phenomena of violence, we could build a stronger concept of violence. And I call that transcendental, because it analyzes transcendental conditions of possibility of violence as action in social contexts. But the empirical sciences are sciences also in their own rights, and we can also learn from them certain things that we could not learn alone by a transcendental analysis. For example, here, I describe the phenomenon of escalation as if it were something linear, which means linear and ascending, which means we start with disagreements, then it increases to annoyance, irritation, verbal aggression, and assault or physical aggression. But very serious psychological studies show, through just experimenting with subjects of consciousness, that verbal aggression does not always lead to physical aggression. It does not lead to further escalation. Very often it leads to de-escalation because it seems to dissolve anger. Bringing anger to a verbal expression dissolves the possibility of escalation. And this is very difficult to figure out from a purely transcendental conceptual analysis. In this sense, a non-transcendental analysis on very basic phenomena of consciousness is also very important for this kind